Before turning the voice to Enrique, who will open officially the Unthinking School series, I just wanted to make some very technical type of considerations. It's very important that you are aware of how we're going to work today using Click Webinar. As you have seen, all of you are able to participate through the chat format, and that's because we have tried to give voice to people in different places at the same time, and the connections in different countries don't work that well, and sometimes it takes some time until your own computers or laptops detect microphones, and some get heard, others don't. So the presenters today will be the ones who are going to speak, and we invite you to participate and make questions and comments through the chat. If you do experience very important problems in terms of audio, please log out and log in again. Sometimes that's the way to solve it. Sometimes there might be also problems with your internet bandwidth or with your connection just today. So if you log out and log in and still the problems persist, don't worry, we're recording this webinar, so we will be able to access it later on. That's what we can do so far now. I'll introduce Enrique. You will be able to see me at the beginning of my presentation later on and see him as well. But then during most part of the presentation, we'll turn video off because we've also found that that deters a good sound on your side. So thanks for understanding. These are technological limitations. The good side of the story is that we are here and that we're able to come together into this space and share knowledge and dilemmas and challenges. And hopefully we'll make the best use possible today of what Click Webinar offers. We have the first way to complement this. So welcome again, and I'll just turn quickly the voice to Enrique, who wants to say hi and welcome as well. Oh, he's coming.
Hello.
Peru is standing on the platform.
Thank you, Vanessa. I hope you can see me. I hope you can hear me well. I might say this twice. My name is Enrique Mendizabal. I'm, as Vanessa said, I am one of the founders of think tanks. And I'm here in Lima. I wanted to take a few minutes. Okay. So very briefly, on think tanks was set up in 2010, and back then I think we were just curious about think tanks. And slowly we've gathered new supporters, among them many think tanks and many funders of think tanks, and developed new initiatives. For example, some of you might know about the data visualization competition we've been running for the last 3 years. Which was one of the facilitators a couple of years ago to come together from around the world. A lot of knowledge that exists in the Young Think Tanks website into practical advice and tools for think tankers and for think tanks. And I see now from the chat that some of my comments might have been breaking off, but I've turned off the audio, and there's some background music, but I'm not sure who is that from. Okay, is it good now? Okay, everybody now says it's much better, so I will not repeat what I've just said, but only say that thank you for joining. Vanessa will remind us, I'm sure, of the limitations of technology and trying to bring together people from all over the world. But I'm really excited to learn more about monitoring, evaluation, and learning for think tanks. And now I pass it on to Vanessa and Dena, who will be able to lead us through this process. So enjoy, and thank you, Vanessa, for the leadership, and thank you, Dena, Leandro, and the other facilitators for your efforts and commitment. Vanessa.
Thank you, Enrique. I will not be able to show you to show my face as what we're telling you, because we'll have the same problem again. Sometimes we're lucky and the first minutes work more or less good, but let's take care of the audio, which is the most important today, that you can listen to us. Okay, so I'm going to briefly share what we have planned for today. We have provided you with some greetings and welcome, but I will also briefly talk in a couple of minutes about the course objectives and how we're going to be working in the next weeks. Then we will spend quite a significant time talking about the specifics of monitoring and evaluating and learning on policy influence, and how complex and what makes this different and unique in some senses compared to other efforts. Then we think it's very important, after we have discussed, and there will be some space for discussion in terms of policy influence, we will also talk a little bit about where you are right now. Many of you were able to introduce yourselves, and we have been able to see that you are coming from different experiences, that you have different relationships towards MEL. Some of you are really deep into that, and it's exactly what you do on a daily basis. Some for just one organization, some for organizations with different levels, and this adds probably more complexity. Some of you want to start making your first steps in terms of MEL, or want to help others to do it. So we will try to accommodate these diverse profiles by leaving space for questions and making sure that we follow up through the forum with your special needs. Also, you will have a practical exercise to conduct, and that will be a very important opportunity to ensure that you are able to learn concepts, methods, and tools we share throughout the course into your own realities. And for that, it's very important to build on what you already have or where you are right now. And that's going to be the second large part of the webinar today, how to do that. And finally, and not least important, we're going to start talking about the key drivers and the main questions that lead or could lead your upcoming MEL efforts. We have shared a background note, and maybe you have some thoughts around key drivers and motivations. Some of you also have shared these in the platform. Thanks for that. So we're going to talk a little bit about how important it is to pay attention to these drivers, and also to start thinking about the big questions for MEL and why it is very important to have really good and valuable questions. So that's going to be the third part of the webinar today. And briefly, we'll also walk you through the next steps so that we're all on the same page in terms of what comes after this first webinar. So that's the agenda. Briefly, the course objectives are related to help you, and together as a group, help you better reflect on how to enhance the impact of researching policy, doing viable, sound, and good and relevant MEL effort, be it a system you have, be it plan, be it just try out some new tools or methods. And this is because also one of the objectives is to contribute to the way you are able to satisfy your own and sometimes your donors. Some of you have already talked about accountability to donors. Yours and your donors' interest in enhancing the way research is uptaken or not in policy. And for that, we need to become better at tracking how that happens or does not happen and why, so that we are able to come up with new ideas and in terms of refining strategies and activities. Also, a good MEL effort will lead into building your reputation and visibility. So it's very important we make sure that the support that MEL provides to your organization has to do with nurturing your needs in terms of being well regarded and making your work visible to relevant stakeholders. And on a more practical level, we also aim at helping you organize what you're doing so that it really becomes useful and relevant and that it's really viable in terms of your own resources, expertise, and needs. And sometimes this effort will also help you make decisions about processes that you need to let go. Okay, so that's what we are going to do throughout the course. Let's start from the very beginning. And the very beginning is, what is monitoring, evaluating, and learning for policy influence? What makes it unique, right? And for that, I would like to share some threads that come from literature on policy influence and the way policy influence is also usually described, and especially related to how it can be monitored and evaluated, right? I think we would all agree on the complexity of policy influence, the many challenges that policy influence itself and consequently monitoring and evaluating it entail. First of all, we all know that there's no single solution to policy problems. Policy problems are complex themselves. Some organizations and people are increasingly talking about wicked problems. Maybe some of you have read about this type of problems. And I think it's a very important distinction to have in mind, right? Policy problems usually are difficult to define. Sometimes there are many possible explanations for those problems, and individuals even perceive those issues differently, right? And depending on how they interpret it, the type of solutions that would take form. This is typical of wicked problems. Wicked problems also do not include a set of criteria that would allow us to say like which solution is right or wrong. More than right or wrong solutions, wicked problems, and most of the policy problems are this type of problems, can receive better or worse solution, or more or less acceptable solutions want each other. So there's always room for improvement, and the consequences may continue indefinitely. There's like not a stopping point for this type of problems. An ingenious problem can be considered a symptom of another problem, right? So it's not something that we solve and it's we can isolate. I think that many of you might be working on some policy problems where coordination among different state agencies or ministries or approaches from different policy areas are needed. So this is, of course, entails, as we are saying, when we're talking about not having a very definite solution that has a beginning and an end, and there's usually a lack of consensus in terms of the problem, makes policy influence quite challenging. Also, there are, as you might have been aware, especially those who are helping others in their advocacy and policy influence efforts, many of the factors and the variables that have a weight in terms of how a piece of research finally is used or not used by which players. There are many intervening factors that cannot be predicted in advance. We don't know how others trying to influence those same stakeholders will move, will say, will act, right? And there are many variables besides the knowledge in itself that have a significant influence in how decisions are made and implemented by policymakers, ranging from cultural or idiosyncrasy, party type of consideration, political type of wins. So there are so many other factors that account for the final decisions and then how these decisions are implemented, that it's very difficult to take all this out and really understand a sole track for the research and the research advice that we provide. As I was mentioning, all these processes in which we participate through policy influence are multidimensional. There are so many stakeholders coming in and out in the different phases, which sometimes are not that linear too. Most of the literature has questioned this linear policy model, whether it's like a real, very neat and ordered path in which one policy stage is clearly followed by another, like from problem definition to the design, the discussion of, about policy options, to the design of a policy or the modification of an existing policy and then the implementation. Right, we were saying that these problems are quite complex and interconnected. So the ways they are being addressed are, and the phases sometimes overlap. And while a specific policy is being evaluated, there are some new discussions in the agenda and about how the problem has been originally framed. So it's quite chaotic. Many stakeholders, multiple levels in which we intervene. Very difficult to isolate our work and the research we generate to contribute to that process. Literature also addresses increasingly the tension between talking about how we have contributed to a specific policy change versus attributing that effect or that the outcomes to just our organization. A while ago in the Pelican community of people interested in MEL, there was a participant that talked about the ripple effect, meaning that in her organization, they are throwing a stone in a pond, and there are so many ripples that come out from that stone that are difficult to track, but at the same time, those ripples interact with ripples from other thrown stones at the same time. So how can we attribute a certain movement in that pond to our stone? Very difficult, mostly, and there's an increasingly consensus about talking about contribution. How can we find evidence and find and detect, identify and collect data that can provide us a basis to say comfortably that we have contributed in a very specific way to these processes. Finally, other challenges in terms of how to monitor and evaluate our efforts have to do with long time frames. We are all aware about how long and how much time it sometimes takes for a body of research or for ideas stemming from research from our organizations finally end up being taken in different ways, and something that failure story today or by the end of a project, a 1 or 2 year project, a failure story might become a successful one 2 years after. Because of a government change, because the critical mass of stakeholders has been reached in terms of understanding the need to address a certain problem, etc. We know that these problems these processes take a lot of time. So, of course, that monitoring and evaluating them also should bear this in mind, right? Sometimes it's the other way around. We have a success story and we have been able to very directly influence the content of a specific policy, but then implementation really fails and started being a nice story to tell is a sad story. So time frames are very important here. And finally, this is not a minor point, many of our organizations, especially think tanks in developing countries, face significant challenges in terms of ensuring resources to do MEL. Many think tanks don't even have a MEL expert or someone who's taking that position. Sometimes it's an effort that it's being conducted in a collective way. and separately in different projects because there's no real time or money there's no budget to have a specific person just committed to that. And or in larger organizations, such as the ones some of you are working with and contributing to, the scale and the scope of MEL is also very large, and you have to make very strategic decisions because even having your whole time committed to come up with MEL solutions and proposals, the time that is available and the people that can help you with this, and even sometimes the type of methods that you employ are not the ideal ones. So you need to deal with this type of challenges. Yes, is the sound, I see here, Jenny, has the sound disappeared? Oh, okay. If you can still hear me, everyone? Yeah? Okay. So having said that, I think that some of you, those who have been walking the development path for a long time would say, okay, but we think that most of the development related projects are have this type of challenges, right? Development problems, which many of them and part of them is, are addressed through policy, do experience the same challenges. So why would policy influence be different and unique in that sense? Well, this might sound a little bit simple, but I think it's a really important point. And I think that one of the things that makes this effort unique is that the way we understand and define policy influence is not clear. What do I mean by this? I read a lot about policy influence, and I worked in a think tank here in Argentina for almost 10 years. And I also worked helping and mentoring other think tanks in their policy influence efforts, plans, and even doing MEL plans. And most of the times we face the first problem, which has to do about, okay, what do we really mean by policy influence? Do we really have a definition? I'm showing these different types of graphs to depict how different people and organizations could understand differently what policy influence is or not, right? Sometimes some organizations only policy influence within a very complex and large network of relationships and outputs and activities by very different stakeholders. And policy influence is just like participating in that, while others have a very defined way of being and thinking about policy influence as policy change or attaining some media coverage, right? This is, I will share this chart later on with more detail. It's just to show that the way, even the visual images that you might have about policy influence are different. And some put more focus into very specific type of outcomes, while others are more thinking about the way people interact, decision makers are influenced, etc. Others are just focused or are mainly focusing the effort on how that piece of evidence or the body of research or a research program or group we have in our think tanks are able to interact with other set of relevant factors in decision making, such as values, resources, or lobby and pressure groups, right? So this is just to show the variety that might be there in terms of how to define policy influence. So before going more deeply into the nuances of a potential concept and the different ways of organizing our understanding, I think that in a very fresh way, I would like to hear from you through the chat. How would you define policy influence today? What is policy influence for you? This on one side, and the other, your perceptions about how much that definition or concept is shared with others in the organization. You might be very clear about policy influence and what is or not policy influence, but maybe there are some contrasts or opposing views or complementary views by others in your organization who would call policy influence other type of outcomes and results that you would not. Or sometimes there's like a very large influence from the donor in terms of, okay, we think these are acceptable type of result, and this is not. So I'd like to read to you a little bit. It's a way of listening to you, but if you, those who are willing to, don't think too much about it. It's not, we're not looking for the perfect definition right now. It's just like, how how would you describe policy influence for you and your organization right now? How do you say this is policy influence for us? This is how we conceive it, and how uh, what is the degree of consensus or disagreement on this concept within your organization? I'm already typing, so I just make silence for 1 or 2 minutes to allow you to come in. So Marjorie, she's sharing that they regard policy influence as increased linkages and interactions between researchers and policy actors and processes. Nice. So the main focus has to do with these links, right, between your researchers and the policy actors and the processes that probably account for the final policies themselves, right? Jen is sharing that they see policy influence as the ability to use information, so information use and cultivate relationships in order to bring about changes in policy or the implementation of policy and the practices. So not only policy per se, but also the practice. So here you have two main pillars, right? The use of information itself for those changes, but also the relationships going around and that probably influence how that information is used and if it's used or not, right? Nice, good. In research campaign, etc., that creates change in policy. Okay, so policy influence would be change in a policy that you achieve through different strategies, producing research, campaigning, probably different type of advocacy strategies. But how would you define that change in policy, Kim? I understand that you have different strategies, but how would you say we have influence? What does a change in policy for you and your organization mean? I see others writing, so please go on, sharing. Sally has found similarities with Marjorie and Jenny, increased linkages and the use of scientific evidence in policy making. I like it. I like the idea of having putting emphasis on the relationships and the links. Actors, of course, stakeholders are continuously interacting with each other, and the way they interact and the type of relationships that take place explain a lot about how knowledge goes around those groups and those relationships. Tim, thank you for clarifying. We see our ask or language, I don't know, ask, I don't know, or language in the policy. If you see your request maybe reflected or the way you frame probably problems and solutions and you see them reflected in policy, right? Enrique is adding an interesting point here, right? About the literature that is usually focused on the idea of change. But sometimes, yeah, right. Sometimes there is need to maintain certain policies, right? Right. That's a very good point. We're also thinking, we're usually thinking about what needs to be changed, but sometimes it's trying for something to be there, right? To for instance, to ensure that a budget is not diminished in terms of, you know, I don't know, like a budget allocated to school infrastructure, for instance. So yes, that's a nice point. So not only about change, but also probably about those things that should keep on being there. Warasu, being able to shape the policy direction based on research as own adapted by policymakers. Nice. Yes, I think that a lot of times, yeah, and depending, and this is related to the policy problems, the direction is very important, right? So I probably it has to do with the way that policy problem is understood, is framed, but components or aspects that need to be taken into account, and really having research to base those type of directions and the way that the policy is geared, right? Okay, Enrique's adding this link with stakeholders is crucial, right? I think that many of us are agreeing on this, on the need to take into account the type of relationships. It's like a very dynamic type of work where we're continuously interacting with others. Alejandro is saying it's also adding that not only the strategic direction, I agree, but the practice. I think it was the first one of the first to participate also mentioned this idea about the practice. Yes, I think practice is very important. We'll talk about this, like going beyond discourses. We might be able to secure or to heavily influence a discursive commitment in a law, in a written law, or in a designed program to achieve a certain set of outcomes with a very clear direction, but then there's a lot going on in practices coming when those are being blended. I'll talk about this in a couple of minutes too. Okay, changes in Suvarna is adding changes in policies to relationships with accountability actors and evidence-based advocacy. Great. Again, I think that this idea of relationships is coming out very neatly when mentioning accountability actors. I'm interested if you could further explain why you're using this description, why you're mentioning accountability. To be interested to get to know what you mean by accountability. Is it those that should be accountable? I see others adding some considerations. Let's spend a little bit more time on your interventions, and then I'll continue. Sometimes, particularly in relation to marginalized groups or human rights issues, limiting negative impact is the best you can hope for. This is a positive change as it is normally defined, right? Jenny is also bringing an important point. It's not only about, sometimes keeping something as it is, as Enrique was highlighting, but also limiting the impacts of something that is going to happen regardless of our efforts, right? And sometimes the proposals and the evidence is to kind of help towards diminishing those negative impacts in those groups that usually traditionally don't have a voice nor power to be part of this discussion and decision-making spaces. So that's affecting policy as well. Influence on the decisions. Olena is here. I am adding. I think many of you interviewed at the same time. Influence on the decisions of the governmental stakeholders on the stage of preparation, adoption, and implementation, but also the impact in the lives of people as they are the receivers and initiators of changes. Yes, Olena, a lot of think tanks work with a very clear focus on this stage that where governmental stakeholders have a large responsibility in preparing and adopting and implementing, but also making sure that the citizens come in, sometimes generating evidence on how they are being benefited or not by those policies and programs, but sometimes also pushing for changes. So bringing on citizenship might also be a way of determining policy influence. And yes, there are some parallel tracks there. Oh, you're going really quickly. Visible and invisible influence and how they are related. That's an interesting point. We can also talk about that in the forum in terms of how much, when you're doing well and you discover things, how, to whom and how much of what you discover you're going to show. There was a discussion in a group of evaluation experts a while ago about the need to sometimes keep some information in closer circles because of revealing sometimes tactics or strategies that if you reveal them, some actors would not longer speak to you or trust you. So that's a dilemma. Kim is saying that they are also trying to influence corporate policies as well as government policies. Very interesting addition. Yes. Is it just policymakers or stakeholders? As I will share later on, we think about all this type of stakeholders. Some, Olena was mentioning citizens, but corporations also have a very important role there in the decisions. Yes, Enrique, this visible and invisible, yes. Meetings sometimes need to be invisible, and sometimes think tanks who work as advisors, direct advisors, need to keep that work in an invisible manner for a while, but they also need to ensure that some of the outcome, final output, that some will be transparent in the public to safeguard their reputation. But for the trust building relationship, sometimes at the beginning, you need to keep some things in closer circles. Thanks, Urbana, for clarifying these accountability actors. So those are the ones that have to do with ensuring budget transparency and participation, right? Having relationships with them to influence the budget policies and processes. So all those who have a say and some participation in terms of how a budget becomes transparent and who participates. Great. I think we have a lot of considerations here, and I think that some of them are complementary. And also, I like the fact that some of you are focusing on some aspects and pillars and some ways of defining. I think that's really good. And from what I heard, I think there's like clarity in terms of how you understand it. Let's move on to see whether you think there's scope to amplify that definition or not. And also, no one talked about that. I would like if you can briefly say yes or no. So, do you think these concepts and these definitions that you are sharing are common for staff members in your think tank and organizations? Do you think this is like a very clear and shared view on policy influence, or are you just responding more from your individuals? How many of you? I mean, is there agreement? Yes or no within your organizations? We have a yes. Mixed. So some people would share that definition probably, or those concepts, and some not. Good, yes. Probably it's not as life, right? No, not a complete absolute yes nor absolute no, but there are some levels of agreement. These are processes as well. As policy processes, these are processes as well in a think tank. Well, Alejandra is saying that she worked in a think tank where most probably it would be a no. Sometimes there are like silos of different types of researchers, and different research teams understand policy influence differently. Oh, good. Okay, so we have another challenging situation shared here by Marjorie about the organization being dominated by researchers who really don't care that much. Do they care about policy influence at all, or is it that they are not interested in the way you are currently doing M&E, Marjorie? What do you think? Is it because they are not that committed to policy influence? More are coming in. Let's see. Manuel is saying here that they care and agree about the definition. Okay, so they were not created. Yes, I've been there too, Marjorie. So many times, some traditional research type of organizations have to walk a long path in terms of changing their mindsets, their agendas, etc. There's like an institutional decision to become more policy relevant. So yes, that's a long way, and Mel can help in terms of showing the benefits of policy influence. So if it's new, yes, sometimes it comes from donors, sometimes it comes from board or the change of an executive director. So yes, researchers have to make an effort in terms of thinking more about policy relevance and influence than what they are used to. Here, Baras is saying that in his case, it's more about discourse in terms of sharing. It's not discourse, sorry, sharing among the male staff what policy influence is, but others have no idea. So probably your next steps will have to do with that. in terms of coming to a decent degree of agreement on policy influence, and because this has to do with impact, with why your organizations are there, right? Uh, Sometimes, yes, as Lydia is highlighting, there's like a concept in theory that all agree to, but in practice, that the practice does not follow from that conceptual understanding. So yes, sometimes experience is good to take in and to nurture that concept and maybe modify it a little bit based on what's happening on the ground as researchers interact with policy makers, policy making processes, and stakeholders. So, okay, let's stop here. So, because I really need to go on, I really like your contributions. I just end with Manuel, who's adding, I need to track your first intervention, Manuel. They care about the definition of policy influence, but most don't believe it is not possible or doable or best when conducting research. Do you mean that it's not possible to achieve intended policy influence, or is it not possible to monitor it and really evaluate what happens after the researchers conduct their efforts? Okay, yes, that's the case. In most, that's very frequent, right? The idea that okay, the intended policy influence, that the ideal one is not achievable, and that really being able to monitor and evaluate is not possible. That's our question for the webinar. So yes, let's go. Let's move ahead and try to find answers in terms of is it worth the effort then. This is not only something we are experiencing. Literature also has made increasing steps in terms of finding new ways to categorize policy influence and defining policy influence is the traditional way. When traditionally there was a big push for research to affect policy, most of the understanding had to do with having the possibility to really affect policy uh, decisions, right? And affecting policy in itself, policy, this is what is called decision regimes. In 2001, Lindquist, many of you might be aware of his first taxonomy that he came up to in terms of, okay, let's not talk only about the possibility to affect a certain law or public program or structure or regulation, but also see whether the policy ideas are introduced in the policy agenda and are understood by different policymakers and other actors, right? Not only policymakers through their conversation. So changes, and this is something that you have mentioned in your definitions, changes in language, adding new elements or new considerations to, this is what I was talking about with the problems. Sometimes there's a need to, okay, we come this far, now we need to add this additional criteria. We need to become more transparent. We need that policy to be more participatory, okay? So this would be about broadening policy horizons per Lindquist. And he also talks about expanding policy capacity. This is when you are helping others to carry out and communicate research, ensuring that more people are skilled and equipped to do it, to do research that is relevant in their context, be it policymakers, research organizations, and other stakeholders, right? So contributions to having stronger foundations for a more research-friendly environment can also be considered as part of policy influence. Then in 2008, Joe Villar developed this table with types of changes, which is also another useful way. These are all complementary. They're just bringing lenses to different ways of thinking about these changes, right? So they classified changes in procedural ones that have to do with changing how things are done, something is done, discursive, these were mentioned by you, these changes in language usage, content, this is the most related to affecting policy regime when there are real contents and changes in written policy, but also start thinking about attitudinal and behavioral changes, changing perceptions of stakeholders, be it corporate, private corporate leaders, be it citizens, or on behavioral, right? The way, like achieving sustainable changes in the way something is achieved or approached, behaviors. And this probably has a lot to do with the affecting the implementation of a certain policy. We came up with another taxonomy. These are all useful. Each one can choose or build his or her own. We think that another useful way to organize the policy influence is to think about levels. Think about the specific changes in policies, in existing ones, or thinking about the creation of new ones, new regulations, new structures, etc. Changes at the level of processes. This has not to do with the policies themselves, but how they are defined, how they're implemented, and how they are evaluated, for instance, in being able to introduce the participatory budget feature for district school management in certain localities, for instance. And then also another level of influence, of course, is all are connected and interactive, which has to do with changes in the stakeholders. Many of the examples you gave have to do with that, right? And these changes could be at different levels. Many of you talked about relationships. We also believe that relationships are very important, and the capacity to affect or build new relationships sometimes it's a critical factor for better policy. But also changes in capacity, in their discourses, in their knowledge, what they know about a certain topic, their behaviors and attitudes. A final consideration has to do with defining policy, but the definition of policy influence sometimes is also difficult because many people prefer to stay on this part of the spectrum and talk about and really talk about policy influence when you have certain indicators and very tangible results for outputs, right? When you are able to gather X amount of high-profile policymakers in a certain meeting. And these are the type of things where usually I think that has more control. That's not total control, but more control. This is a spectrum from total to none, and where attribution is more easy to be achieved, right? And to say that, okay, we did this policy brief, and these parts of the policy brief directly fed into our policy. So as you go through your activities, to the effects on the stakeholders, to the changes that take place in the policies, but then the processes themselves, and to impact the degree, the level of control that you have on and the participation you have in this the process diminishes. And we'll talk later about the fact of impact, and there's a discussion right now where thinkers are not only requested to track all this, but also how the policies that they recommended or in which they participated end up having impact on the final beneficiaries or not. This is something we will delve more deeply along the course, but it's something to leave there. So we believe at Politics and Ideas we use this definition. This is just to share, and most of the conversations that we'll have reflect this understanding that we have in terms of policy influence, where we think it has to do with changing, affecting any type of change in those who are participating in the policy decisions, all type of stakeholders in the processes, and or in the public policies in terms of all these type of levels of change that I had just mentioned: attitudes, behaviors, discursive commitments, capacities, and relationships, and as well as real and concrete changes in policy content and procedures. And now with your interventions about mitigating negative impacts or thinking about those that sometimes change does not need to be the objective, maybe it's time for us to kind of rethink and revisit our definition. So just to end up this part, because Dena needs to start, I'll share with you in the forum a very provocative video. I think we won't have time to play it right now, from Alain de Botton. And just, I mean, when sharing this video, my idea is to expand your current thinking in terms of who defines and who should define what is policy influence within your work. What is really your holy grail? How would you and your partners, because our idea is that you share all these discussions with other colleagues as well in your efforts to come together in terms of achieving policy influence and how to monitor and evaluate it. Really think what would success mean for us today? Maybe you will have different definitions for different research departments, and then maybe one or two main strands of success for the organization itself. And this is something that will be changing as your contexts change. But this is a very interesting talk in terms of starting from ourselves. We have a lot of pressure from others. Show me your impact, tell me you're successful, demonstrate your contributions. But I think that Alain is very sharp in terms of refreshing this view and allowing ourselves to rethink about the definition of what policy influence is or not, how successful we are or not right now. So please, it's a long video. You can watch the whole of it. Otherwise, I'll give you instructions about the specific part of the TED Talk that it's really worth listening to and using in terms of the decisions you will make throughout the course in the next weeks. So that being said, I'll switch to Dena. Sorry, before that, Dena, if you can just bear with, give me two or three additional minutes. But are there any urgent questions about what I presented that you need to make right now? Otherwise, let's continue the discussion. And that's the idea of having a forum. Let's continue the discussion in the forum. But if there's something really urgent, just, I don't want to leave you uncomfortable. Right now? No? Are we all set? Can we move on? I think we're set.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa. Can you hear me? This is Dena speaking. Okay, hi everybody. So before I started, can you hear me? Just want to check that people can hear me. So busy people, a lot of chatting going on. Okay, good. Thank you. There we go. Sorry, my chat was a bit slow. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Vanessa. That was really interesting. And I think up till now, Vanessa's been talking a lot about the conceptual idea of what is policy influence, and making the very important point that it's really important to define it for yourselves. Where is your organization at? What are your policy influence strategies? And what is it that you want to be able to measure? And what I'm going to be focusing on is how can you start finding out how to define the scope of your monitoring and evaluation for policy influence, the systems that you're going to be building. So, but I also want to bring it down very much concrete to help you to think about what it is that you will be building based on what you already have. So one of the tools that we introduce to you is a stakeholder analysis, or a situation analysis, which is a good way of finding out what you have in your organizations. But as a means of starting off, let's hear from you. What do you think you have in your organizations that could be useful for building an M&E system, or monitoring, evaluation, and learning system around policy influence? I'm going to move to the next slide because it gives you some ideas of the kinds of categories where you may look in your organization. You may look for example, you may have strategies and plans that help define your objectives. You may have certain human resource capacity that can help with monitoring and evaluation, maybe in terms of research skills. Look at those categories on the slide and think about what it is that you have in your organization that may help with an M&E effort, MEL effort. I'd like to hear on the chat from you. Okay, strategies and plans. So very important to look at those kinds of documents to start seeing what are the objectives that your organization are defining. Those would become some of the things that would lead to the key questions that you would want to ask about your policy influence. Are we achieving those? Do we have the right strategies and tools for achieving those? Are we building relationships with the right stakeholders? Have they been identified in those strategies and plans? I see a lot of people are typing. Okay, so you'll also have project evaluations and donor reports. Now, these are really important tools for helping you to learn. Evaluations will try usually to uncover what it is that's working and what's not working well. Now, we know all too often those kinds of reports end up, the old cliche, gathering dust on shelves. But they are useful for if one wants to use them. We're very much focusing on the use of evaluation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning in this course, that they can give very good ideas about where the organization can improve in terms of its MEL efforts. Also, if you're encouraging your evaluators to be more participatory, the process of doing the evaluation itself can be an important learning process and help to reflect. So you also have things like looking at your social media hits, looking at your online statistics, all sorts of kinds of data collection that will tell you about your successful communication, how many newsletters you send out, who reads those newsletters. Those are all important things that you can already use for your monitoring and evaluation efforts. Some of you have shared drives and spreadsheets. Those are electronic tools. If monitoring, evaluation, and learning is very much about collecting data and sharing that data and having it accessible to people when they need it. So it's important to have electronic systems that can facilitate that. Alexandra says this morning she had a chat with a communications specialist from a university in South Africa who was telling me that they did not have a formal LEE system but started to build one because of donor funding reports. They were trying to find new ways of reports, especially altmetrics. Altmetrics, what are altmetrics? I'm not sure what those are. But let's talk about new ways of reports. I mean, I think that what I'm hearing a lot more about is how not to write the 125-page report, but how to make that more accessible in terms of user-friendly summaries, maybe podcasts, turning it into policy briefs, using graphic images, using data visualization, and so on. Some of the tools for learning definitely include after-action reviews, something that's very popular at the moment, I think, in a lot of organizations, is starting to experiment with this tool, is how to use something which we can reflect. Are you doing after-action reviews already, Kim, in your organization? Because so for those of you who don't know, it's a tool where you, after you've done a certain action or a group of actions, you can look back and say, what did we do well, what didn't we do well, and what did we learn, or what will we do differently next time? In our organization, we do that every 6 months on all the projects that we've done, and it's fantastic. We're able to see where we make the same mistakes over again and make sure we don't do those, and also make sure that we improve our proposals and our work for the next time around. So if you look, I'm going to move on, that's great. So there's a lot of information in your organizations that you already have, and just to summarize some of those things that you brought out, you may have a lot of qualitative things. You know what they say, what you can't measure, you can describe. And so a lot of organizations say, well, we can't do quantitative, we don't have statistics, so what is it that you can tell a story about through a case study, through a film clip? Policy influence stories, where you're able to put together the story about what you did, who received that information, how they may have changed or maintained, in fact, the policy or the direction or the agenda that they were on. Thematic analysis, not just looking at your citations, but saying, what are the people who are citing us saying? Is that discourse in line with what we're promoting, or are they citing us as a way of showing that, in a negative way? Social network analysis. If you take, for instance, all the attendance registers from all your different courses or events, and you started seeing, are the same people attending events? Can we tell from our attendance register data if people are mixing on an ongoing basis through our work, that you can start to see that you're building up a policy community around your topic? So ways of actually using the data that you have, maybe the more quantitative data such as attendance registers, surveys, citations analytics, and actually using it to tell a story about your policy influence. And then of course the learning component, we already mentioned after action reviews. SWOT analysis, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis is a very nice tool for looking at strategy. Did it work? Didn't it work? You know, may have formal or informal reflection sessions over tea or watching a current affairs program, and strategic discussions, and then also including a lessons learned component into your regular, people mentioned quarterly reports, annual reports. Include a lessons learned component in there, so it forces people to think, what did we actually learn about this, and then to make sure that when you're planning in the future, you're actually drawing on those lessons learned. So we have a lot of information already in our think tanks. I think what is important is how we organize it. So what my message and our Vanesa's message is keep it simple and start from what you have. Find out what you want to know about your work. Here we're talking about, when we said people, you have strategies and plans. Are those working? What are the objectives you want to achieve? What are the policy influence objectives you want to achieve? And to really crystallize that, to be sharp about that so that you can focus your MEL efforts around those. Then it's about identifying what you already have to help you answer those questions. So we've looked at a whole range of things that you may already have. Then it's about organizing what you already have. So if, for instance, you have evaluation forms and you may be writing case studies and you may be doing podcasts and interviews, identify a set of key questions that you can consistently ask across those tools that you use, so that you can start getting a body of data out that can help you to answer those questions in a way that is more systematic, and that becomes less anecdotal, because the more data you have around the same questions, then the more the weightier your evidence becomes. And then, of course, it's about organizing so that you can learn from your experience and have the evidence that you will use in your future planning. There's something that we will talk about in the next webinar is what are the important types of change that you want to achieve, and to identify levels of change. You know, when we're doing something like a theory of change, which is presented in the picture there, where we're building pathways of change, then Vanessa says she lost me. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, so when we're talking about building pathways of change, Vanessa mentioned different kinds of change. We talk about results change, building levels of change. It's important to think about that. You know, are we measuring immediate changes, long-term changes? And we'll talk about that more in depth. But it's also about that's also about organizing, making sure you're looking for change in the right places and looking for in the right time frames. So in order to find out what you want to know and what you already have, the process can be very important to help you with your monitoring evaluations. I heard already some of you said some people are not at all interested and some people are very interested. Using the process of starting and doing a situation analysis in your organization can help you to build motivation and buy-in for your M&E system by involving others. You can involve people by saying, you know, we're looking towards building a monitoring evaluation system, and you know, what are the key questions you would like this to answer for you. You can involve people in collecting information. You know, you can do it through interviews or workshops. And you would also want to do some kind of document review, ask people to give you their documents, and you'll find very often people are very excited to share with you the tools that they may have developed. So I'd also identifying your champions, those people that are motivated and interested, and then you can build your system around those, help those people to become leaders and early adopters. It's also important in your situation analysis to identify the drivers, and Vanessa is going to talk a lot more about that just now. What are the things that motivate people, but motivate people in a way that excites them to participate in your MEZ system? And then you want to also, once you've done your situation analysis, provide feedback. Show people what it is that what you have in the organization, what you can build on, what it is that you may focus on, and then plan the way forward together. Some organizations establish a small committee that drives the development of an M&E process. Then there are a number of tools that one can use for a situation analysis, and that they help you really to be more systematic in your inquiry. You could do a SWOT analysis on your M&E system, making sure it focuses on what you have within your organization for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or what opportunities exist around you, or threats that may inhibit you from doing that well. There are tools for monitoring, evaluation, learning capacity assessment. If you were to Google it, you'd find it says monitoring and evaluation capacity assessment tools, because learning is, the L is quite a new phenomenon being added in there. But the slide that I showed you here, the categories, you could develop a tool around that to say, do we have capacity in terms of electronic systems? What do we have in place in terms of decision-making processes? What do we have in terms of budget for M&E? So that would be a way of doing an M&E capacity assessment, would be to look at these different categories and to go and do questioning around that. And then you must decide where you want to start. Some organizations, you may already be doing M&E all over, and you may feel like it's not quite right, you're not quite getting it right, you want to fix it up. Do you decide to go organization-wide and fix everything at once, or do you decide to start small with one project or one activity even, gain confidence and move on? And that very much depends on your organization. If your organization is quite advanced, you may want to tweak it here and there. You may want to involve everyone at once. If it is something that is brand new for your organization, people are quite resistant still, you may want to start small, prove how it can help, that it, and then gain confidence and move forward that way. I wanted to share with you an example of an organization, a think tank in South Africa called the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, which is about promoting not only transitional justice, but that together with justice must come reconciliation, very much in the tune of what happened here in South Africa. And what we did there was we did a monitoring, evaluation, learning capacity. We used a capacity assessment tool, so we looked into all of those different categories. And how we did it was we did workshops with each program. They were pretty advanced. They'd had an M&E system which was developed by, together with a consultant in a participatory process about 3 years before they were looking to refine it. And we then had workshops with each and every program, because it was impossible to get the whole organization together at once, which sometimes is preferable and work in groups. But we worked with each program, we did document review, and we did a lot of interviews. And in general, we found that they were doing quite a lot of monitoring evaluation. They were collecting a lot of information. They had monitoring evaluation learning plans, but the results hierarchy was confused. Sometimes what were outcomes were actually outputs, and sometimes what they had as activities were actually outputs, and it was quite confused. They hadn't got the levels right. They were also trying to collect M&E data on every small activity. Too much information. I don't know if you've seen the cartoon. There's a lovely cartoon where there's a person walking into someone's office with piles and piles of information, and you see this little head sticking out from behind the desk, and the guy says, if I'd known that I would have to analyze all that information, I wouldn't have asked for it in the first place. And I think this is what was happening here at IJR. People were drowning in forms and sheets and not being able to see what was really useful. And people also wanted to know if they were making a difference, and they've just felt like the upward accountability, the way the system was designed for upward accountability for donors, wasn't really meaningful for them. So it was more like a chore to do all this reporting. They weren't really learning much from it or using it in their work. So some of the solutions that we came up with when we were looking at the system was, if they were collecting too much information that they didn't know what to do with, well, a solution is really go back to that, knowing what you want to ask. Be clear about what policy influence questions you want answered, and be selective with what you gather. So this is one of the challenges working with researchers, we often want to, oh, everything is so interesting. We want to know about all of that. But interesting is different to necessary. What are the necessary information that we need to answer our questions? And what are the necessary questions in the first place? That will help us to limit the scope of our monitoring evaluation effort so we don't drown in data. The second is that, IJR was saying we can't tell the whole story because we don't have all the data, or the data that we have is not organized in a way that is useful. So if you can organize your objectives into results chains, make sure that the process of transformation is described in your results chain so that when you're collecting data, you will be able to say, we did this and it resulted in that change, which then led to that kind of policy influence. Maybe it was a change in capacity, or it was a change in networks or relationships that then made a group of organizations work together so that they could influence that particular policy stakeholder. So if you can identify a possible process of transformation or change, you can then set up your M&E system to track that, rather than say we did this and we're looking for something very high up, and then you have this black box in the middle where you're not actually able to tell a story about what actually happened in that process. And in doing that, you may check what you have already and how it can just be better organized. Very often organizations don't have the information when they need it, so they may then be scuttling around to suddenly do some interviews, or find out, go and analyze those evaluations that you collected 6 months ago but haven't actually written up into a report. It's important that you have it when you need it, and you try to be systematic, and a monitoring, evaluation, and learning matrix is something that, or plan is something that can help you to do that. And that's one of the exercises that we're going to be doing with you in this web. How do you organize the information, and how do you actually synthesize it into a way that is systematic? Okay. The last thing is that money is often seen as a burden only done for donors. So if you can find out what really motivates people, it's really, what is it that really, most of us work in this kind of work because we are motivated by some values that get us out of bed in the morning and get us to our office, and we're going to be helping people or communities or certain interest groups. What is it that people want to know about the effect that that's having on their lives? If we can tap into those social motivators, then we can really build, I think, a stronger monitoring evaluation systems. I wanted to ask you, because any system is only good as the people who uphold it, how do we think that people can be motivated to, how can people in an organization be motivated to collect and analyze M&E data? What do you think some of the drivers are in your organization's motivations for doing M&E? Something that Vanessa is going to be looking at a little bit more. But do you have any questions about what I've spoken about around doing a situation analysis? Or any examples of what you may already have done in your organizations that we can talk about, we can chat about? See, some people are typing, so we'll wait for that to pop up on our chat screen. Oh, thanks, Marjorie. Yes, I think it's just about, maybe taking some small steps and doing, that would, always a good starting point is to find out what you have. Yes, wanting to know if they've made a difference. Now, defining that, I think, is really the starting point. What kind of difference do we want to make? Kim says she started doing an MEL survey with staff in some of their country offices, but she likes the way we frame the components in the MEL capacity slide more. Thank you. Yeah, it's tried looking at different aspects. I've also done some blogs on the P&I site where we look into, like, we've looked at HR, we've looked at, I think the next one will be on electronic systems, looking at the different aspects, the kind of considerations that you would look at. So we could maybe provide some links to that. Oh, and Vanessa saying that we will also provide some further readings on doing MEL assessment. So for Alejandra saying it's about gaining relevance and reputation, helping them to build new partnerships with key stakeholders for the organization. Yes, so if you can speak to, even if you're doing, for instance, one of the tools in the situation analysis is a stakeholder analysis. If you could even speak to some of your stakeholders and find out how they value the relationship with the organization, whether they even read the emails that come into their inbox. You know, if you could speak to them about the communications, if you could speak to them about what they would like to find out from the M&E system, it doesn't have to be a desk exercise, a stakeholder analysis. You can actually speak to those stakeholders and find out from them what it is that they value, and whether how your M&E efforts can contribute to the reputation and that you are building. Savannah says we do a lot of case studies and impact, but doing anything other than that was a challenge. So we started small, improved importance in order to convince others in the organization. How did you do that, Savannah? How did you prove others? Did you have seminars around your M&E, or did you share it with others in document form? A lot of people are talking about being motivated by your values, finding about wanting to make a difference, and what is the difference that we're making. It's and I think when you do those, what I found is that when you do the situation analysis work, which you bring people together to discuss that question, when you're doing some kind of situation analysis and you say, you bring stakeholders together, you bring a project team together and say, what is it that you want to, what difference do you want to make? What change do you want to make? What questions would you, if you could ask your stakeholders any question about their life, what would it be? What questions would you like to answer about your work? You find people, I find people walk out of those meetings excited, build some energy for your monitoring evaluation system that you can say, well, that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to build a system that can help you answer those questions. I find that if you can create that kind of excitement up front using your situation analysis, it really helps. So Enrique is saying, related to Jenny's comment, knowing how long the process of influencing can be, how is it possible to show staff the impact studies have had? Well, I think one of the things we've been looking at, and Vanessa showed that slide earlier about the where it is that you can focus your gaze in monitoring and evaluation. If you're looking here, if you're building results chains, and if you're building pathways of change, it may be that it takes too long or it's impossible to tell that story. But it might be that it's easier to tell the story. What are the intermediate effects on stakeholders? Are people now, journalists, writing better articles? Are there more articles about which reflect your worldview, for instance, as an example, taking media influence? Is the discourse are more people interested in the topic? So it might be that you want to focus your gaze a little bit earlier in the process, or look at changes that may be not in terms of time literally, but also in terms of depth, the kinds of processes that may be put in place towards bringing those changes out. So there's always a story to tell that may not necessarily be always around impact. So for example, with the think tank that I was working with, they had as their ultimate goal, to change the G20 to be concerned about developing world issues. But when we looked at the countries they were working in, there wasn't even a policy community that was interested in the G20. They were like a lone voice in the universe. So we said, why don't you introduce as an intermediate outcomes, building a policy community, getting at least other think tanks interested in this topic. And then we could tell a story after 3 years about how much more research was being done in this area, and building a policy community became the policy objective. And so that's one way to do it, is to bring your outcomes closer to home. Tino saying we conducted a stakeholder analysis when we began crafting our MNL strategy and identified our employees as key stakeholders. Our employees are very eager to understand what impact their work has had and how they can make their work even more. That is a great, great starting point if you've got motivated people and you can draw them in through your process. Does it make sense what I've been talking about, bringing your outcomes closer to home? Looking for things where you can actually tell a story and and that's what Vanessa was also talking about, trying to define policy influence in a way that is more manageable and more easier to describe. Okay, so I think we've spoken about motivators and what are the motivators. Now I think I'm going to hand over back to Vanessa to talk about some of the drivers that you can look at in your policy influence and systems. So yes, Enrique. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to hand over to Vanessa. Thanks so much for engaging and for your good examples that you brought and for sharing, and we will share some more tools with you around doing a situation analysis. It's a very nice way to gently start uncovering what it is you already have and build on the strengths in the organization. Thanks, everybody.
Full and clear. I wanted to end up the webinar focusing on drivers and questions. I see that some of you have shared in the module and are already, again, stating your needs in terms of getting to know more specific tools and ways to collect information or to track your policy influence. We'll get there. Don't worry. We really want to be practical and ensure that you end up this course with some new ideas of potential methods for data gathering, some menus of indicators and types of outcomes, and that's going to be mainly the focus of webinar 2. And you'll do that and you'll use that in your exercise. But before delving into the details, we wanted to keep this webinar at the strategic level, as you may have seen, starting from this conceptual discussion about policy influence, thinking about where you are right now, what the organization has in place in terms and the gains you already have in terms of MEL, and also exploring a little bit further in terms of the motivations, the drivers for you to make any changes or to initiate new MEL efforts. And also talking about the big questions. Dena has mentioned already the importance of finding a good set of questions. This will guide you in terms of then selecting the methods, the objectives, the levels of your assessment, and then consequently the type of outcomes, outputs, and indicators. As we shared in the background note, it is very important for you to kind of go back again to the reasons for doing MEL within your organization. We shared the five more typical and large ones, which of course you may have more than one, and they don't exclude each other. But in general, there are one or two reasons that when organizations are setting up or modifying their MEL systems really have a large role. One of them, a very frequent one, has to do with accountability. Many think tanks are increasingly preoccupied in terms of demonstrating why different donors, local donors, international donors, etc., should continue to support the research that they produce. And for this, they really need to produce sound and high quality evidence about the effects of this research. And the way to produce that evidence, when accountability is your main driver, will be probably different from conducting MEL, because you really want to empower people within your organization to become better in terms of policy influence, or you want to make some changes in your research agenda to ensure that it is policy relevant. So these are there are different reasons, and if you're trying to empower people, the type of evidence, internal evidence that you will need to generate, the type of discussions, internal discussions, and the way you use the data you produce will be different. When your main goal is to really help others understand how they are doing their work, what could be enhanced, what could be done differently, etc. So again, go back to those reasons, think about how they play within your organization. Some people within your organization might be more prone to have one driver, others, but you will have probably a one common system. So it's important to start having those discussions and try to build some degree of consensus on the priorities of doing MEL. And this, of course, has to do with use. We also mentioned in our background note the insistence, and that all that we also shared some resources for this. Michael Patton, who in the evaluation field is very well known because due to his concern of real use of evaluation and monitoring efforts. And this is something we need to come again and again to come back to the fact of who will use the pieces of evidence that we are producing throughout our efforts, be it the case studies, be it the results of an after action review, be it a list of very specific indicators on specific outcomes and outputs. So who will use it and how? How will we use it? Are we using these pieces of evidence to inform our planning? Are we really, are we really gathering the type of information, and does this data and the analysis of this data allow us to make good conclusions in terms of how we should plan our upcoming efforts or not? So again, thinking about the use and the potential users and the potential type of users will significantly affect what type of information, how we organize that information. So this is not an easy task, and it might, depending on the degrees of complexity of your organizations, some of you are working with chapters in different countries, so this makes it even more difficult to come up with, like a very clear agreement on priorities, etc. You might use the MEL assessment to start identifying where the most interest resides. And then build on that. And in this sense, this will have to do with the way the system is counting with people, and the way users of the MEL system are or not satisfied, of course, will really affect the way the value of the overall MEL effort and how it is perceived by others. Sometimes the work is around how to make sure that value is understandable, and maybe sometimes just to frame the analysis and the findings in a different way, and to use them and to use them in a different way, and that just with some tweaks around people would start perceiving the value differently, and counting with them and allowing space to listen to them and to see how we can enhance that use is a very effective way to focus the effort in what's of real value for the organization. However, there's another very important aspect of the development or enhancement of a current MEL system that has to do with the determination of your key questions. I'm following here an excellent reading from a article paper from Davidson, and I will upload that into the forum as well. where she stresses out the importance of asking ourselves whether the questions that guide our MEL efforts are driven by the methods we're using, or are they really driven, or are the methods really driven by our questions? And what does she mean by this? She has found that many organizations and many evaluators concentrate on what she calls the low-level questions, which are very attractive because they are questions that are easy to answer. These questions usually are around improvement. Questions like, did we reach more people? Did we convince more policymakers? Did our policy brief got response from the people we were interested? Are we getting better with our advocacy efforts? Are we gaining more public support for a campaign? And the attraction of this type of questions that are around improvement is that they are answerable. They are related to specific and tangible indicators where we can see whether we have improved or not the performance. And then we feel like we can really give clear answers. We can have control of those indicators. We can have a measure. There are questions for which answers can be measured. We can have very specific indicators to answer those questions. But then some relevant questions are lost in the way of answering these more low-level questions, which are practical, and sometimes we need to make them, but we also need to think about other type of bigger and larger questions, which, as she says, we might not be able to have a concrete and clear and defined answer to those questions, but they are an approximate answer. Draft answers to those questions is more valuable for the organization and its work than very clear answers at the other point, at the other level. Why do these important questions go unanswered? These important questions, just to make it more quick for you, might have to do with, for example, to what extent does this particular initiative, it can be when you're tracking a specific project, make a unique contribution to the strategic vision of the organization, right? Another could be like, is this initiative really consistent with our overarching values? So when we're tracking policy influence, are we looking into this type of considerations as well, or are we just trying to determine whether or not we have achieved some set of results from our outputs and our efforts that can, on which we can claim, okay, we have contributed to this policy? Do we ask ourselves about how are we doing this? Is the ways we're doing it consistent with what we value most? Do the different also, when we consider at the project level, do our different projects and initiatives fit with and complement with other initiatives? Are we having a good policy mix, policy influence mix, or are there unnecessary overlaps, right? Why do this type of questions usually go unanswered? There are two common traps. One has to do with the one I was mentioning in terms of selecting ways to answer questions that are testable, or selecting questions that are answerable, the oversimplification we do. And so we try to we end up centering attention between a pre and post assessment of what was out there before we launched a certain initiative or program or project, and what is happening or what is changing year to year. So what is testable, what is answerable, that is what really leads our decisions on what we are going to track. And so our question might be like whether, okay, is there an increased awareness of policymakers about the need to improve transparency, for instance, in budget allocation? So we center the whole MEL effort to respond to that, to those type of questions. Sometimes also there's an overcomplication trap where we get lost in the myriad of details. So we collect lots of information. As Dena was mentioning before, we have a really complex and different systems and different methods and ways of generating that evidence, but we get lost in those details, and we are not able, as Dena was mentioning, to tell the big story behind it, the relevant story. So the point here is that it is better to get approximate answers to truly important questions than really seek the best precision on measuring, which is at the end trivial, right? And this, determining what is truly important and what is trivial is a very personal path, and in terms personal, I would say like organization. It depends on each organization. But the point here is to invite you to think about what are the questions driving your mail efforts. What are you trying to answer? Are you brave and courageous when making those questions? We were discussing a minute ago about how to get people motivated. And while it's true that some of the findings and some of the information that a good mail system can reveal can help them improve or make them feel good about what they are doing, the answers to some of these type of more strategic and high-level questions might be uncomfortable, not only for the people working in each project or program or initiative under the MEL assessment, but for the organization in general. So some of them are uncomfortable. Some of them are really not easy to answer. But it's very important that at least we take a look at this type of questions. I'm sharing in this PowerPoint some of them. You can think about those that are more relevant to your work and your efforts, and make sure that all this effort that you are doing, all this investment and all this participation by others is geared towards coming up with not the perfect answers, but the type of draft answers that will help you move on in a real, tangible and strategic way, in a real, relevant way for your organization and for each team. And for that, questions need to be evaluative, not merely descriptive. If you're having questions that are just descriptive, where you will say what happened, this happened, and a list of reporting on indicators, we will probably have some evidence to kind of make some arguments, but probably there won't be enough as to guide us to the next stage of evolution in our think tank, right? So I invite you to take some and spend some time, and this will probably drive and be the starting point for you to select how to do the exercise, which will be further on. We need to continue interacting in the forum and have our second webinar before that, but start to think and maybe discuss with others among the organization about these questions. Do you have any urgent questions regarding it? So I think that one of you was mentioning, I think it was it Barasu that was saying, I don't know, or who was telling us about, okay, many people within my organization don't believe we can really effect important changes in policy influence and demonstrate that. They have a question there. That's not a question that leave out of this table. If we have many people thinking about that, I mean, is it really worth doing MEL or policy influence? Are we really capable of doing or of measuring or assessing our work in terms of policy influence, or should we measure ourselves differently? And this again links back to the video I was recommending you. The type of criteria and ways you decide to use to assess whether you're heading in the right and inspiring direction or not. And this will change and will vary according to the stage and the particularities of each think tank. But this is a clear invitation for you not to shy away from them, at least even if you don't feel it's that the adequate time to share or to discuss this with others, just for yourself. What happens? I mean, what are your big questions in terms of policy influence of your organization? What are the things you would really like your efforts to answer? Just write them. Start to think about them. And when you feel ready, you can share them with others as well. And this is important because this is what will allow you to tell the big and the relevant story behind being able to track specific outcomes, which are very important as well, and outputs and indicators. This chain is a very important one, from like minor type of signs of changes of indicators revealed to the big story. This is not an easy, and it's not usual. It's not always, as I was talking about the chain. Sometimes we will find black boxes, and sometimes the type of information we need to fill in that black boxes is not achievable right at this point. But we need to come back. I mean, we need to document that. We need to identify that and to know what we don't know. And at some point, when I find new ways to find that information. But let's start bringing in the relevant pieces of the puzzle so that we can tell better our story, be it at the organization level, be it at a program level, be it within a specific project, right? And for here, again, this is, I was touching the point about writing about the questions yourselves before, but also leave some space to validate those questions. Without promising right now that you will be able to answer, but listen to others. What are their questions about their work? Everyone is spending, every member of the organization is spending every day lots of hours doing his or their work. I doubt that any of them is not interested in becoming a little bit nearer to assessing whether what they are desiring has to do with what they are doing. This is a long effort. There are no easy answers, but let us not move away from that, because that's our genuine motivation to do the work we do, or to be part of the type of organizations we're working in. But all of think tanks are looking into change, usually, or to at least to diminishing, as Dena, I think, was mentioning this, diminishing the negative impacts of, as Enrico was saying, trying to maintain something. These are aspirations, and they are very important. And the way we can link up more day-to-day type of data collection and indicators to our big stories, each member of our think tank's his or own story of change, and the organization story of change, which will evolve. There might be more than one story. It's important, and we really want to start from here. So we want to start from this type of more strategic and umbrella considerations, and have some discussions that might allow you to kind of refocus, sometimes refine, or build up a new area of concern, so that what we do next in the upcoming webinar and in the forums, in terms of more concretely identifying methods and ways to respond to those questions, are really geared to something that is of true value for you and your organizations. So that being said, are there any questions or thoughts linked to these ideas? Does anyone, I mean, do you think, if you had to think about your big questions right now, do you have them? Is it something that you're used to work with, starting questions? Any type of questions or comments around the aspect of questions? So welcome to make them right now before we finish, and we delve into more practical type of steps to end up the webinar. No? I see Kim, yeah, coming in. Was this clear? Was this valuable? If it's not clear, I can share, and we'll continue in the forum. But for me, it's important to understand whether this makes sense to you as a starting point. Do not only think about policy influence in general and where you stand in terms of assessing your capacity and what you're doing right now, but also in terms of the big questions for your organization. Yes, Kim, I know that. The obsession, I think Quinn Patton talks about this metric obsessions like a talk with indicators is really large in many places, and we usually get lost. I usually get lost also with think tanks. When we start working with the specifics, we then forget about the bigger questions. So I'm happy to hear that this makes sense for you and that it was helpful. Yes, Enrique, here you have some of the questions. These are very generic questions. What we could do is as an exercise to share some of your potential more specific questions in terms of policy influence. But it has to do like, okay, maybe the project has achieved what we expected and there are good outcomes, but are they really making a contribution to our policy environment the way we wanted to? I mean, is it really relevant in terms of the change that the think tank is pushing for? Good. Nice to hear that you find it clear. I will. Oh, good. So good timing for this, Marjorie, in terms of the big questions, and you need to revise them. Let's continue working on this on the forum. I'm very interested in if anyone wants to share this process or try to do an exercise in terms of questions. I'd be happy to help. I'm very interested in helping you throughout that process and coming up. And maybe if someone is ready to share some of them, I think that's going to be inspiring and helpful for the others. Yeah, yes, I understand that you are, but I'm happy to feed in if you think it would be helpful. So thank you for all this feedback. I hope you have enjoyed the walk so far. As we already anticipated through the chat, we will share the PowerPoint and the link to the recorded version. So if you want to come back to certain points, you're invited to do so. We are also going to continue discussions in the forum. There are some many things that probably you need to digest for a longer time now. So we are open to questions and comments related to all the content that was shared today. If you're interested in further expanding a specific point or aspect, there are a lot of resources there. We don't want to overwhelm you. This is a short course, but we have a lot of things that might be of help. So feel free to ask, right? Any questions, comments, or needs, please go to the online forum, use it. The idea is that we continue interacting from here to our next webinar. And the exercise, we have decided to share it on April the 19th, because we really think that to start thinking about it, we need to go through webinar 2 and its contents, which will be more focused on specifically deciding levels, formal and discussions about outcomes, outputs, and indicators, along with potential methods to gather information along those terms. But let's spend the next week thinking about the overall levels of your questions, where you stand right now, where you can build on, and the type of big questions that you would like to take into account when thinking about changes or innovations in your mail systems. Thank you, Marjorie. If you can share them later on, probably. I know that sometimes these are very confidential, so don't feel obliged at all to do it. It's just for the ones, and it can be just questions that are yours and not for the whole organization. But I think it would be a nice group exercise to kind of brainstorm about potential big questions in terms of policy influence. So that being said, the webinar is done. If there are any specific questions, we can continue through the chat now. Yes, Solena, let's see. We can do a testing just with you. If you can use a separate different equipment to see if the problem is on your side. But I also get Leandro to get in contact with you to see whatever we can do to help you improve the sound. Sometimes it depends on your internet connection, as I was saying, but also on your equipment. Thank you, everyone. Your interactions have been very valuable. I look forward to continuing interaction in the online forum, and we are here available for you in the next upcoming weeks. Thanks now.